The crisis over Gaza entered a dangerous new phase this Friday when United States President Donald Trump issued what he called a final ultimatum to Hamas. Posting on his Truth Social account, the president set a strict deadline. The Islamist group must accept his proposed Gaza peace deal by 7 p.m. on Sunday, Brasilia time, 6 p.m. in Washington, or face total hell. In his own words, if this final agreement is not reached, all hell will break loose, the likes of which no one has ever seen. The message, written in Trump's characteristic style and shared across his social media, immediately reverberated through diplomatic channels and newsrooms worldwide. Trump's warning was accompanied by another blunt statement saying, an agreement must be reached with Hamas by Sunday evening at 6 p.m. Washington, D.C. time. Every country has signed on. If this last chance agreement is not reached, all hell, like no one has ever seen before, will break out against Hamas. This was not just a social media remark. It was a direct challenge to Hamas and a stark signal to the international community that the United States was prepared to escalate if its peace proposal was ignored. The ultimatum represents the culmination of weeks of back-channel diplomacy in which the United States, Israel, Egypt, Qatar, and several European countries' powers sought to push Hamas toward a negotiated ceasefire and a phased prisoner-for-hostage exchange. But according to officials close to the talks, Hamas continued to resist key elements of the plan, particularly the provision requiring it to release more than 2,000 Palestinian detainees in exchange for a full lifting of the blockade and a multi-billion-dollar reconstruction fund for Gaza. For Trump, the deadline is more than symbolic. His administration has framed the offer as the last chance for peace, a phrase repeated by US diplomats in private calls with Middle Eastern leaders. Standing at the podium during a separate announcement on prescription drug reforms in the Oval Office earlier in the day, the president appeared composed but resolute. He thanked his cabinet at the conclusion of the event. But even as he left the room, the sense of urgency surrounding his Gaza ultimatum dominated press questions. A senior US official later clarified to reporters that the Sunday deadline is not merely rhetorical. If Hamas fails to agree, the official said, the consequences will be swift and decisive. When pressed on whether that meant military action, the official declined to elaborate, but insisted that all options remain on the table. Diplomats in Washington and European capitals reacted cautiously. Some praised the push for a resolution, while others worried that such stark language could push the situation toward further violence rather than compromise. Analysts noted that while many countries, particularly in the Gulf and Europe, have supported the broad contours of Trump's plan, Hamas remains deeply skeptical, seeing it as an attempt to impose US and Israeli priorities without adequate guarantees for Palestinian sovereignty. Hamas officials in Gaza issued a brief statement calling the ultimatum an unacceptable dictate and accused the United States of serving the occupation's agenda. A senior Hamas negotiator speaking to regional media on condition of anonymity said the group is prepared for dialogue, but not under threats of what he called total destruction. Inside Israel, reaction was mixed. While Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu welcomed the deadline as a way to pressure Hamas into compliance, opposition leaders warned that Trump's approach could provoke further unrest and derail fragile understandings that had been emerging in recent weeks regarding phased ceasefires. Trump's defenders argue that the president's blunt approach is necessary, pointing to past decades of inconclusive peace efforts that often faltered over details of prisoner exchanges, border controls, and disarmament. In an earlier post on Truth Social, he wrote, "Every country has signed on." That claim, while somewhat overstated, reflects the support the US has rallied from key allies including Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and several European nations who believe that a swift resolution is essential to prevent a wider regional conflict. The stakes are indeed high. The Gaza conflict has dragged on with intermittent flare-ups, humanitarian crises, and deepening despair among civilians. Recent reports from aid agencies describe food shortages, collapsing infrastructure, and growing public health risks in the densely populated enclave. The Trump administration argues that its plan, which includes an immediate 72-hour ceasefire followed by a staged release of prisoners and hostages and a monitored withdrawal of militant forces from key border zones, offers the only realistic path out of the cycle of violence. Critics counter that the plan leaves critical political questions unresolved, particularly the future governance of Gaza and the long-term status of Palestinian refugees. Human rights groups have warned that a military escalation threatened by Washington could worsen the humanitarian disaster rather than end it. In the corridors of the United Nations, reactions ranged from guarded optimism to open alarm. A European diplomat described the ultimatum as the sharpest use of brinkmanship in the region since the last Gaza war, warning that both sides could miscalculate. Meanwhile, in Cairo and Doha, mediators who have long served as go-betweens in the conflict scrambled to reach Hamas leaders in an attempt to avert a showdown. For ordinary Palestinians in Gaza, the prospect of yet another major military campaign is a grim one. Many remember the devastating toll of previous conflicts and express skepticism that any new US-brokered deal would change the daily realities of blockade and poverty. In Washington, however, Trump and his advisers insist the deadline is a necessary shock to break what they call the cycle of endless negotiation and periodic war. A senior White House advisor speaking to reporters late Friday said, "The president believes Hamas has been given every reasonable opportunity to act in the interest of its own people. The time for endless delays is over." Military analysts noted that while Trump's rhetoric often includes dramatic warnings, it can also serve as a negotiating tactic, one that seeks to project strength and compel adversaries to compromise. They pointed to previous episodes, such as Trump's threats against North Korea early in his presidency, which eventually gave way to direct diplomatic engagement. Still, the possibility of rapid escalation cannot be dismissed. Reports from regional military observers suggest that both Israeli and US forces in the eastern Mediterranean have been placed on heightened alert in anticipation of potential hostilities if the Sunday deadline passes without agreement. Across the Middle East, reactions were mixed. In Egypt and Jordan, governments emphasized their support for any initiative that could stop the violence but urged restraint in language. In Turkey, officials accused Washington of pursuing what they described as coercive diplomacy. In Tehran, leaders condemned the ultimatum outright, calling it evidence of US bias and warning that further instability could ignite a wider regional conflict. International human rights organizations renewed their calls for all parties to prioritize humanitarian access and protection of civilians. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency reported that over 500,000 residents in Gaza remained in need of urgent medical supplies and food assistance. Aid convoys long delayed at checkpoints were said to be ready to move if a ceasefire could be implemented. By late Friday evening, Trump's post continued to dominate headlines worldwide. News channels repeatedly displayed screenshots of his Truth Social messages, highlighting the phrases "last chance agreement" and "all hell will break loose." Commentators debated whether the deadline signaled a genuine commitment to peace or a prelude to military action. Former US diplomats appeared on talk shows urging caution and warning that issuing ultimatums in such stark terms can leave little room for face-saving compromise. Yet supporters of the president argued that only a clear line drawn in the sand could push Hamas toward an agreement after years of fruitless talks. As the clock ticks towards Sunday evening, attention remains focused on whether Hamas will shift its stance and whether the mediators can broker last-minute concessions. For the residents of Gaza and southern Israel, the coming hours hold their breath as the prospect of either a fragile peace or a new spiral of violence looms.